I'm an avid backpacker. I was exploring some trails in Oregon during a solo camping trip I decided to take after losing my job at the architecture firm. Long story short, budget cuts hit hard, and I was part of the second round of layoffs. Complete devastation on all fronts. I was 28. Oregon was actually one of the states I'd always wanted to visit for its incredible wilderness. There are some amazing old-growth forests out there that I think every outdoor enthusiast would love to experience. I had chosen the Willamette National Forest as my Oregon destination because I had read incredible reviews about its remote sections. One of its biggest draws for me was that it had numerous isolated areas that were still accessible by car. I enjoy solitude when I'm hiking, so crowded tourist trails packed with families aren't really my preference. I selected an unmarked section of the forest and drove my truck as far up this winding dirt road as possible. I parked, climbed out of my vehicle, and surveyed my surroundings. I loaded my pack and checked my phone. No signal. Exactly what I was hoping for. I made a careful note of my starting location and began the journey. I know backpacking alone in unmapped areas is risky, but I don't think I get the same satisfaction following established trails. I always save the offline map of whatever area I'm planning to visit. Many people don't know that your phone's GPS continues working even without cellular coverage. I know what you're probably assuming, but no, I didn't lose my way. I wish I could say, that's what this story's about. The truth of what happened to me is something I'm still trying to process. My goal was a rocky outcrop at the ridge of the mountain, which was roughly 4 or 5 miles distant. The landscape was quite challenging, so I was only managing about 2 miles per hour. About 90 minutes into my trek, fog began rolling in. Even though it was light, I decided not to proceed. Hiking in heavy fog is one of my biggest concerns for safety reasons. Frustrated, I reversed direction and started following my path back. Eventually, I caught sight of my truck in the distance, and I felt relieved that this disappointing adventure would soon end. I approached my vehicle and encountered a disturbing scene. Both front windows were completely shattered. I felt the anxiety begin to build. There was no way both windows had been accidentally broken. This had been intentional. I spun around quickly, examining the forest in all directions. Nothing. I strained to listen as intently as possible, but any sounds I might have detected were masked by the whisper of wind through the trees. I considered my choices. Without a signal, I was essentially trapped. I would need to find coverage so I could request help, but from what I recalled, I had lost signal more than 15 miles back down the dirt road. Hiking back to town seemed like an exhausting prospect. I needed to reach a higher elevation. Fortunately, the destination I had initially planned was exactly that. I had to risk it. I didn't feel secure walking 15 miles down the exposed road where I would be completely visible. Without hesitation, I turned back toward the forest and started my route again. I was roughly 2/3 of the way to the ridge when I noticed a subtle movement in my peripheral vision, perhaps 30 yards to my right. It would appear and disappear in rhythm with my steps. I resisted the urge to turn and stare. I simply increased my speed, confident I was probably a more experienced hiker than whoever was following me. The afternoon was progressing, creating long shadows across the forest floor. The fog was still present, and I was beginning to feel anxious. After creating some space between myself and whatever was tracking me, I took a careful look behind me. I couldn't see anything, but someone could have been concealed behind any of the hundreds of trees surrounding me. At last, I reached the outcrop. Miraculously, there was actually cellular service at that elevation. I didn't hesitate for even a moment, not stopping to appreciate the scenery. I contacted the sheriff's department and described exactly where my truck was located, explaining what happened, including my belief that I was being followed. I also mentioned that I had roadside assistance coverage. I ended the call, grateful that someone now knew my location. There was still a major issue, however. I would have to travel back through the forest before complete darkness, while somehow evading whoever was tracking me. I couldn't simply walk directly back through the woods. That would be inviting danger. I considered my options before deciding that I would need to attempt walking in a wide arc back to my truck, hopefully bypassing any ambush someone had prepared. I traveled along the ridge for some time before descending into the forest from a completely different direction. I hadn't studied this section of the forest, though, so I opened the map on my phone and hoped my orienteering abilities wouldn't fail me. Everything was progressing smoothly for a period. I hadn't detected any suspicious noises behind me or ahead of me. I might have been premature in that assessment, though, because less than a minute after that thought, I heard footsteps crunching through leaves to my right. I turned to investigate, but saw nothing. And several minutes later, I heard another disturbance, this time from directly ahead of me. My heart sank as the realization hit me. There were several people out there. I increased my pace again, transitioning into a steady jog. As if the situation wasn't frightening enough already, I discovered something that elevated my terror from moderate to extreme. There was a crude shelter constructed in a small clearing. There were 8 or 9 tree stumps arranged in a circle around a fire pit. Someone had been using this recently. I jogged past it and continued forward, glancing behind me periodically. Several minutes later, I heard movement from my left. This time, I turned fast enough to glimpse someone's shoulder disappearing behind a large pine tree. That was my breaking point. My steady jog immediately became an all-out run through the woods. I no longer cared how much noise I was making. I had to escape that forest. As I ran, the sounds surrounding me grew more intense. It was obvious that I was being pursued. They had abandoned any attempt at stealth. I kept running, too scared to look back. At one moment, I couldn't resist the impulse any longer and glanced over my shoulder. I spotted at least 4 people, all wearing dark clothing and moving rapidly toward me. I maintained my sprint, knowing my truck was close. The following minutes were the most terrifying I've ever experienced. Picture being completely exhausted while facing the possibility of serious harm. I couldn't reduce my speed. My survival literally required it. Finally, I spotted my truck ahead, and parked right next to it was a sheriff's patrol car. I reached his vehicle and collapsed, nearly losing consciousness before he could even approach me. I looked back, and those people who had been pursuing me had vanished completely. The deputy informed me that he had already contacted my roadside assistance, which I deeply appreciated. I provided him with a complete incident report, and what he revealed was disturbing. Apparently, Oregon contains numerous isolated communities that live off the grid, and encounters with these groups in unmarked forests aren't unusual. The particular forest I was exploring had a documented history, especially regarding survivalist communities and separatist groups. The deputy explained that I had likely encountered one of these communities, and that I had made a poor decision exploring an uncharted area of the woods. Honestly, what that deputy told me several years ago was probably accurate. I still struggle to understand this, though. If they were upset that I was trespassing on their territory, why not simply inform me of that? I can't comprehend why they would feel compelled to stalk and chase me through the forest, especially after vandalizing my truck. This experience continues to occupy my thoughts regularly. I wouldn't describe myself as a professional explorer, but I've been passionate about urban exploration for the better part of 20 years. I've photographed dozens of abandoned factories, hospitals, and schools across the Midwest. I've documented nearly every ghost town in 3 states. After 2 decades of this, finding new places that genuinely surprise me has become increasingly difficult. Recently, I started using satellite imagery to locate forgotten industrial sites in remote areas. It's unconventional, but the thrill of discovering something completely untouched makes the extra effort worthwhile. I use a GPS device to mark waypoints as I explore, creating a digital breadcrumb trail back to my vehicle. Every few hundred yards, I drop a waypoint and take a photo of the exact spot from multiple angles. This system has never failed me. The challenge I had chosen this time was more ambitious than usual. I planned to explore the remains of Copper Ridge, an abandoned copper mining operation in the Colorado Rockies. The mine had been shuttered in the 1960s after a series of accidents. The entire area had been fenced off and declared unsafe for decades. You can find plenty of information about the place online if you're interested in mining history. I'm not particularly drawn to the folklore. I focus on the photography and documentation. I don't concern myself with the stories about strange lights or equipment running on its own. Technically, the area remains off-limits to civilians, but that obstacle has never deterred me before. I anticipated having the entire site to myself, which is exactly what I prefer. The drive from Denver took about 4 hours on increasingly rough mountain roads. I reached the perimeter fence around 10 in the morning, giving myself plenty of daylight to work with. My initial impression of the place was genuinely unsettling. I had read that the site was completely abandoned, and I was startled to discover how thoroughly dead it actually was. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through the pine trees. You don't fully appreciate the constant background noise of nature until it's completely absent. Picture standing in a soundproof room and hearing only your own heartbeat. That captures the atmosphere perfectly. To be completely honest, this level of silence wasn't entirely new to me. I had explored other sites where wildlife seemed to avoid the area entirely. I continued forward, dropping GPS waypoints as I went, trying to ignore the oppressive quiet that seemed to press against my ears. I kept expecting to hear something eventually. A bird call, the rustle of a small animal, even the sound of wind through the abandoned structures. Nothing came. After an hour of walking, I was actually hoping to encounter another person. That's how deeply the silence was affecting me. Eventually, though, the eerie quiet stopped bothering me as much. For the first time since entering the site, I felt myself relaxing into the work. That sense of calm didn't last long. Without warning, I noticed something that brought all my anxiety rushing back. In the distance, I could see a light flickering inside one of the old mining buildings. It was a pale, bluish glow that pulsed irregularly. The kind of light you might expect from malfunctioning electrical equipment. That's the best way I can describe it, though even now I struggle to put it into words. The light was particularly disturbing because it was the only sign of activity in the entire dead zone. I stopped and watched, trying to determine what could be causing it. I had never seen anything quite like it before. There was a possibility it could have been reflected sunlight bouncing off broken glass, but the sky was overcast and the light was clearly coming from within the building. I concluded it was most likely old equipment that somehow still had power, even though I knew that was essentially impossible. I moved away from the building until I could no longer see the light. You're probably wondering why I didn't just turn around and leave immediately. I wish I could give you a good reason. I told myself that if I encountered one more inexplicable thing, I would abandon the exploration entirely. As I walked, I started wondering how any equipment could still be operational in a place like this. Was there still power running to the site? There was no way I could have missed power lines or a generator. Maybe the power had been connected before I arrived. Maybe someone was actually maintaining this place. Would anyone really do that after all these years, though? It seemed highly unlikely. These questions and others were cycling through my mind when I discovered something significant. On the wooden post directly in front of me, there were clear markings carved into the wood. I know it sounds like something from a horror movie, but I'm completely serious. The markings weren't random scratches. They looked like numbers and symbols, possibly old mining codes or survey markers. I began looking around and found that several of the nearby posts bore similar markings. That was my breaking point. I turned around immediately and began retracing my route, following my GPS waypoints back toward the entrance. I'm naturally curious about everything I encounter, but even I was thinking this exploration had gone far enough. I followed my digital trail for about 30 minutes before seeing something ahead that I definitely had not seen before. There was what appeared to be an open mine shaft directly in my path, surrounded by warning signs and yellow tape. I stopped walking, completely confused. I know my own observational skills. There was absolutely no chance I would have missed something as significant as an open mine shaft. My GPS waypoints should have led me around any major hazards, not directly toward them. My blood turned to ice water. I spun around and began running back the way I had come, checking my GPS display constantly. How could I have been so careless with my navigation? Someone had clearly altered my waypoints to direct me toward that mine shaft. But how was that possible? Could someone really have been monitoring my movements and accessing my GPS device remotely? I didn't have time to work through all the implications. I was focused entirely on getting out of that place as quickly as possible. The problem was that without reliable waypoints, I was essentially lost. I kept running, not bothering to move quietly. It would have been pointless anyway. The area was dead silent except for the noise I was making. I stopped to catch my breath and checked my phone, hoping desperately for a signal. Miraculously, I had one bar of service. I located my truck on the map and determined which direction I needed to travel. It wasn't too far away. Then, just as suddenly, The signal disappeared completely. It didn't matter at that point, though. I knew which way to go now. That's when the light appeared again, only this time, it was much brighter and seemed to be moving. I ran harder than I had ever run in my life, even though my best athletic years were long behind me. The light seemed to be following me, staying just at the edge of my peripheral vision, but every time I turned to look directly at it, I couldn't pinpoint its exact location. After the most terrifying 15 minutes of my life, I finally reached the fence line, and the light vanished completely. I jumped into my truck and drove away as fast as the mountain roads would allow. That experience completely destroyed my interest in urban exploration. Here's my rational explanation for what happened. Some security guard or caretaker was monitoring the site and noticed my presence before I noticed theirs. They then, for whatever reason, decided to track my movements and somehow interfered with my GPS device, hoping to direct me toward that mine shaft. I assumed they had some kind of powerful flashlight or spotlight that created that moving light, which explains why it disappeared so suddenly once they realized I had escaped. I know there are problems with this explanation. For instance, how could someone remotely alter GPS waypoints in real time? I'm open to anyone suggesting better explanations. Maybe there's a legitimate reason that mining site remains off limits to civilians after all these years. When I was 17, our usual hangout spot was the abandoned quarry, about 2 miles from town. It sat at the end of a winding dirt road that most people had forgotten about, surrounded by dense pine trees and overgrown brush. The quarry had been shut down for decades, leaving behind a deep crater filled with dark water that reflected the sky like black glass. There were rusted warning signs everywhere, but we ignored them. It was the perfect place to escape parents, homework, and the suffocating boredom of small-town life. That particular Saturday in late October, my friends and I had been hanging around my garage, working on Jake's motorcycle and complaining about having nothing to do. The sun was starting to set earlier these days, painting everything in that golden autumn light that made you feel like something important should be happening. Marcus suggested we head to the quarry to watch the sunset and maybe build a small fire. It sounded better than sitting around doing nothing, so we packed some snacks and flashlights. There were 4 of us that day, me, Marcus, Jake, and my cousin Dylan, who was visiting from the next town over. The walk through the woods was peaceful at first. We followed the old trail that generations of local kids had worn into the earth. Dylan had never been to the quarry before, so we were telling him stories about all the crazy things that had happened there over the years. When we reached the edge of the quarry, we found our usual spot on the rocky ledge that overlooked the water. The view was incredible from up there. You could see the entire crater and the dark water below, plus miles of forest stretching out in every direction. We had been there for maybe 20 minutes when Marcus pointed toward the far side of the quarry. A pickup truck was slowly making its way down the steep access road that we had always assumed was completely blocked off. The truck moved carefully like the driver was trying not to make noise. We ducked behind some large rocks and watched as the truck parked near the water's edge. 2 men got out and walked to the back of the vehicle. They opened the tailgate and started pulling something heavy from the truck bed. At first, we thought it might be camping gear or fishing equipment, but as they dragged it toward the water, we could see it was wrapped in what looked like a large tarp or canvas. The way they handled it, the awkward weight distribution, made my stomach turn cold. The men worked quickly and efficiently, like they had done this before. One of them had brought a small boat that they inflated using a manual pump. The whole process took about 10 minutes, during which none of us said a word. We watched in horrified silence as they loaded their bundle into the boat and paddled out toward the deepest part of the quarry. When they reached the center, they struggled with something for a few minutes. Then we saw the splash. The boat rocked slightly as whatever they had brought disappeared beneath the surface. They paddled back to shore, deflated the boat, and loaded everything back into the truck. Jake whispered that we needed to leave immediately, but before we could move, Dylan accidentally knocked over his water bottle. It clattered down the rocky slope, making what sounded like thunder in the quiet evening air. Both men froze and looked directly up at our hiding spot. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, one of them started climbing up the steep slope toward us, moving fast despite the difficult terrain. We ran harder than I'd ever run in my life. The forest seemed to grab at us with every step, branches catching our clothes and roots trying to trip us. Behind us, I could hear crashing sounds as the man continued his pursuit. Jake knew these woods better than any of us, so we followed him as he led us on a winding route back toward town. We must have run for 15 minutes straight before we finally stopped to catch our breath behind the old cemetery. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to call the police. When the dispatcher answered, I tried to explain what we had seen, but it sounded crazy even to me. She said she would send someone to meet us at the cemetery. 2 officers arrived within 10 minutes. They listened to our story with serious expressions, asking detailed questions about the truck, the men, and exactly where we had seen them. One officer took notes while the other made radio calls. They asked us to show them the location, so we led them back through the woods to the quarry. By then it was getting dark and the truck was long gone. The officers used powerful flashlights to examine the area where we had seen the men working. They found tire tracks in the soft mud near the water's edge and what looked like drag marks leading to where the boat had been launched. One officer took photos while the other called for additional units. Over the next few days, the story was all over the local news. The police brought in divers and search equipment. They spent 3 days combing the bottom of the quarry before they found what they were looking for. The remains they recovered belonged to a man who had been missing for over 2 months. His family had been searching desperately for him, putting up flyers and organizing volunteer search parties. The police said he had been the victim of a robbery that had gone wrong. Within a week, they arrested 2 men based on our descriptions and the evidence they had gathered at the quarry. It turned out these guys had a long history of criminal activity and had been suspects in several other cases. My parents were proud of us for doing the right thing, but they were also terrified. They made me promise never to go back to the quarry, and honestly, I had no desire to return. The place that had once felt like freedom now felt tainted and dangerous. For months afterward, I would wake up in the middle of the night thinking about what we had witnessed. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if Dylan had not knocked over that water bottle. Would we have just walked away and never said anything? The trial made headlines in our small town. We had to testify about what we saw that evening, describing everything in detail to a courtroom full of strangers. It was terrifying, but also important. The victim's family thanked us afterward, saying we had given them closure. Both men were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The judge said our testimony had been crucial in securing the conviction, but knowing we had helped bring justice did not make the memories any easier to live with. Years have passed since that October evening, and I still think about it sometimes. I never returned to the quarry, and as far as I know, neither did my friends. The place was eventually fenced off completely, with new warning signs and security cameras. I am writing about this now because I saw one of those men in the news again. He died in prison last week, and seeing his photograph brought all those memories rushing back. Some experiences change you permanently, and witnessing something like that definitely falls into that category. The quarry sits there still, dark and quiet, holding its secrets beneath the surface. I often wonder about the other stories it could tell, the other mysteries that might be hidden in those black waters that no one will ever discover.